So good afternoon, everybody. At least for us in Jerusalem, it's 4 p.m. Welcome to the 10th Eurasian Peace Science Conference. And my name is Arie Kacowicz. I'm your academic convener. So without further ado, we have the plenary session and we'll start with the greetings and blessings. So we'll start with our Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Tamir Shefer, who teaches at both the Department of Political Science and the Department of Communication and Journalism, followed by Professor Pinar Bilgin, who is she's a professor of international relations at Bilkent University in Turkey, and she's the president of WISC, the World International Studies Committee, and followed by Professor Galia Barnathan, my dear friend and colleague, who's the director of the Leonard Davis Institute of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So Tamir, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you, Arie. So on behalf of the Hebrew University and particularly the Faculty of Social Sciences, I would like to welcome you to the 10th Eurasian Peace Science Conference. We would love to have you here, all here in Jerusalem, and actually we specifically secured great weather. Too bad that some of you cannot look outside of the window to Jerusalem to see how nice it is outside here. And I can only hope that we will be able to invite you all to Jerusalem sooner than later. Peace Science in times of a pandemic is a great title for the conference. We all know that the pandemic had a significant impact on society. I can tell you that last year, we had here in the Faculty of Social Science a year-long running seminar on empirical COVID studies organized by Dani Miododik, who is here, who was Vice Dean for Research. It was done by faculty members and PhD students from all departments, and we found that there are numerous exciting opportunities for great studies. So there are some positive outcomes of the pandemic, at least. And I hope that you will show us, and I saw that some relevant panels in this conference, that there are maybe some positive outcomes regarding world peace and the pandemic. Maybe people will have less time to fight with neighboring countries. I would like anyway to thank all the participants, and particularly I would like to thank the organizer, Arie Kacowicz, Galia Press-Barnathan, and Reşat, and good luck. Have a nice conference.
Thank you very much, Tamir. Pinar, your turn.
Okay, thank you. Now, thank you for this opportunity to address you in my capacity as the president of World International Studies Committee. WISC is an association of national and international professional associations dealing with all aspects of international studies. We don't have individual members, we have professional associations like the ones that you may belong to as our members. And we work with your professional associations to bring people together from different parts of the world. We organize our own conferences, but we also collaborate with others who organize their own conferences and see what kind of partnerships and collaborations emerge out of these. So what we try and do then is to make WISC more than the sum of its parts through such collaborative efforts. And we are very happy to have the opportunity to be a part of the 10th Eurasian Peace Science Conference as well. I know that the conference is in very good hands. I'm working very closely with Professor Kacowicz himself, who's one of the academic, who's one of the program chairs of our forthcoming conference in Buenos Aires in June, July 2022. And I'm particularly excited to be with you as a student of security studies. The questions that you address are as relevant and important as ever. I'll try and follow as much of the conference as possible in these 2 days, and I wish you a very successful and productive 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. And now to Galia.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all here. Where here is actually not that obvious, and I had two thoughts that came to mind in the week leading to this conference and from this morning until now. On the one hand, I think looking at the program of this conference, you can see that where there's will, entrepreneurial spirit, and technological capacity, it is possible to create these new imagined spaces and to make room for the growth and maintenance of new and old imagined epistemic communities. And maybe in time, this will also have some material implications in terms of cooperation that might emerge from, a random encounter in a conference like this. I think it's true for us as a research community, but I think especially for a peace science community, a peace science community by its nature should be preoccupied with generating these openings and spaces for global dialogue, and I think this is a great opportunity. This is like the fun part. On the other hand, I think as we sort of embark on this, big building new virtual spaces project, there are all these non-virtual reality checks of geography and germs that kick in, and I experienced this live, yesterday with all the issues regarding time, time zones and mix-ups about, what the right time zone is, the number of scholars we had that had to drop due to COVID unexpected visits, and we wish them, of course, the best of health. My own son, who is traveling in Colombia, just found out that he's, positive. So, it's everything is like mixed up together. So what do I make out of this? I think that we need to balance our vision of building these new imagined spaces, a vision that seems really, really viable in these 2 years of COVID, where we're all sort of experts on Zoom, even if we're like beyond the age of 50. But at the same time, we need to balance this with these constant reminders of the actual lived spaces that we inhabit, that we need to engage. And I think striking a balance between these two is crucial for us as peace scholars who are interested in doing both rigorous but also relevant research. So this is like a metaphor about, I think, how our field. Just a few words about us. I'm greeting you here actually in my capacity as the director of the Leonard Davis Institute for International Relations. I assume most of you do not know much about our institute, so let me just take the opportunity of saying a few words while I admit people into the panel. So our institute is a research institute that's located in the social science faculty in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and our main focus is in advancing cutting-edge research in issues related to international relations from a very broad interdisciplinary perspective. And we also have a special emphasis on issues related to gender conflict and peace under the umbrella of the Sophie Davis Forum. So this hosting or facilitating the hosting of this conference, needless to say, sits really well with the various agendas we're trying to promote, bringing together scholars from different levels of their, stages in their academic career, from grad students to senior faculty, from 21 countries, that's what I counted at least, discussing such a broad spectrum of issues related to peace, war, and peaceful change. That's like perfect. So I just want to say thank you for everyone involved in this. It was a pleasure, doing business, cooperating with WISC, of course, with the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change, with the Peace Science Society, and here in Israel, of course, cooperating with the International Relations Department at HBU, where our fellow scholars volunteered to chair and discuss panels here, and with the Israeli Association for International Studies. I especially want to thank Professor Reşat from the International Relations Department at Koç University in Istanbul for his initiative and then advice and support. And of course to our convener, Professor Arie Kacowicz, my dear colleague from the IR department at HebrewU, for doing the work probably of 4 people with the positive energies that very, very few people can actually generate. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed the conference so far, and you will enjoy the rest of the day, whatever time zone you're in. Thanks.
Thank you, Galia. So let me add just 1 or 2 minutes of thanks to the list, because it's a long list. So first I want to thank the Davis Institute for hosting the conference, you, Galia, and Hanok Wolfer, and Arie Dror, who's now a newly mom, Nadav. I checked that with her, a new baby. I want to thank Isaac Delgado, who's our, from Mexico, the technological wizard who sent you all those beautiful messages. I want, as you mentioned, I want to thank Reşat, Professor Reşat Bayer, who actually, you started all this, Reşat, remember you and Bilgi, we have this conversation, right, about having another round. I remember 2 years ago at Koç University, you host us in Istanbul. It looks like ages ago. It was 2 years ago, right? In January 22, at the beginning or before the pandemic. I also want to thank the people who are behind us, literally, the computer support people. It's Itzhak Weiss from the Faculty of Social Science, Dalia and Dina, and all those who are helping us. The organizations that Galia mentioned that they are associated with this conference in one way or another, the Israeli Association of International Studies, WISC, the Global Research Network on Peaceful Change, GREMPEC, that TV Paul initiate, and the Peace Science Society. And as I mentioned that to you, Galia, when we were thinking about this months ago, about a possible title, I was not aware how prophetic you were, right? Peace science in times of a pandemic. Unfortunately, that's the reality that we have to cope with. But at least we have to look at the bright side that we could bring together. At least there were 215 people that pre-register, and the numbers are growing. I hope they will get to 50 until Charlie Kupchan will join us. So from all around the world, from all the latitudes, from the Americas, North and Latin America, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East, and to gather and talk about peace. I have my own bias as a peace scholar for 30 years. So here we go. Thank you very much. And last but not least, also thank you for all the colleagues that volunteer to be co-hosts and chair and discuss papers. Okay, so now we turn to the roundtable, and the roundtable will be about the relevance of peaceful change in our turbulent times. So let me very briefly introduce our panelists according to the order of their presentations. So the first speaker would be, I discover your name, TV, Tazla Barki, TV Paul, a professor, James McGill Professor of International Relations in Political Science at McGill University, author or editor of 21 books and 85 journal articles. I don't know when you do all of that. And since September 2018, a fellow at the Royal Society of Canada. And since 2019, TV took upon himself this idea of a global research network of peaceful change. Last year, in 2021, TV and other colleagues edited a very important volume, the Oxford Handbook of Peaceful Change, including 41 chapters. Actually, some of us are authors in that volume. The second speaker will be my colleague and friend, Professor Markus Kornprobst, who's a professor of international relations at the Vienna School of International Studies, the diplomatic Academy in Vienna, published 8 books. His research projects include several issues such as global orders, peaceful change, diplomacy, arms control, digital IR, global health, and he has a particular interest about Africa, and he will be talking about Africa. The first speaker is my colleague and friend, Professor Galia Press-Barnathan, the director of the Davis Institute, an associate professor in the Department of International Relations at Hebrew University. Her areas of interest include regional cooperation, IR theory, political economy of transitions to peace, and in the last few years, she moved into the new realm and territory of popular culture. And Galia might refer, among other things, to the Middle East. We wrote together a chapter in that handbook. The first speaker will be Professor Reşat Bayer. He's an associate professor of international relations at Koç University in Turkey, interested in international cooperation and conflict, peaceful change, power transitions, peace within and within countries, how peaceful relations emerge and evolve. The fifth speaker in the roundtable would be Professor Benjamin Benny Miller. Benny is a professor of international relations at the School of Political Science and the head of the National Security Center at the University of Haifa, the author of 5 books, including the recent From Truman to Trump, explaining changes in US grand strategy. He's interested in many issues, causes of war and peace in the 20th century, in the 21st century, and explaining the challenges to the liberal international order, and I assume that he might refer to that. Last but not least, and he told me that he might be a bit late, my former teacher and colleague and friend, Professor Charlie Kupchan. He's a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University in the World School of Foreign Service and the Department of Government at Georgetown, and a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And like many of us, he has been also a practitioner. He has been the director for European Affairs in the first Clinton administration and senior director for European Affairs with the Obama administration, and author of 10 books, including his recent book about isolationism, a history of America's efforts to shield. I cannot read my handwriting. Isolationism, as well as he has a splendid book on stable peace. So we have a round table, which means a round table, people are supposed to talk to the point, 7 to 8 minutes each of you. For me, the relevance of peaceful change in turbulent times, I can think about US-China, what my former mentor Gilpin, he agonized about that, whether we are heading to a next hegemonic war, order versus justice, climate change, large and medium powers, you name it. And what the TVU did by resurrecting the interest in peaceful change, I think that it deserves a session, and it's also a good opportunity for talking about this volume. So the order of, and I did not prepare specific questions. You could, of course, you can reflect on the relevance of peaceful change in those turbulent times. So I try to think about a kind of a logic to the roundtable. So we'll start with TV, introducing the subject. Then we move to Markus, visiting Africa, then back to the Middle East with Galia, then Reşat on this relation between large and smaller powers. Benny, with your interest on nationalism, populism, what went wrong with the liberal order. And finally, maybe Charlie might tell us about this interesting idea of resurrecting the concept from the 19th century into a global concept of powers. again, if we are disciplined, we will still have fun to have an interaction, not only among us, but also with the audience. Without further ado, TV, you have your 7 to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Arie, and colleagues there for this interesting global meet in times of crisis. Actually, I think this is a great opportunity also to take stock of where we are heading, or at least from our understanding. So as Arie mentioned, we just published a 41 chapter handbook, Oxford Handbook on Peaceful Change in International Relations, last year actually. And there are a few people on that volume sitting there, including Arie, Markus, Galia, I believe Benny is also there. And the aim of the handbook was sort of provide a global summary or understanding of the big topic of peaceful change that Arie mentioned was big deal in the 1930s, 20s, 30s, and then of course certain periods like the end of the Cold War, but not given the attention among IR scholars as much as it should have. And so we are trying to resurrect to some extent. And I must say that I was really impressed with the quality of work that we received, and considerable amount of work went into it, and we produced it during the time of the pandemic. So that's something to be noted. There is a lot of interest in the IR literature about realism versus liberalism, realism versus idealism, constructivism, etc. But I think there is a big practical reason why this subject is very important. As Arie mentioned, the rise of China now is almost inevitable, and we don't know how that is going to result in. In addition, as you can see, the changes taking place in the global order with the arrival of the pandemic, climate change, etc., suggesting to broaden our understanding of going beyond interstate relations to a large set of issues that affect global governance and peaceful change. So mine is what you call the introduction, where I define what we mean by understanding, or a maximalist or a mini-max understanding of peaceful change. The minimalist is a change in international relations and foreign policies of states, including territorial or sovereignty agreements that take place without violence. A maximalist is referring to transformational change that takes place non-violently at the global, regional, interstate, societal levels, leading to deep peace and higher levels of prosperity and justice for all. And so then we discuss a little bit of system change, the Gilpinian understanding there, regional changes, the changes. More importantly, the chapters that actually set the tone are the discussion of interwar period debate from 1919 Paris Peace Conference to 1939, international studies committees work, conferences work. Several conferences were held on the subject, by the way. Then getting into Cold War, post-Cold War era, and the rise of China, the Gorbachev efforts, and a lot of efforts by the rising powers or the new powers that are trying to change the global order. Theoretical perspectives are discussed quite elaborately. Realism does not seem to have much of a hold on change. Adamant that cyclical perspectives seem to be looking at what you call persistence rather than change. Liberalism is definitely the most focused on peaceful change with the Kantian tripod. Constructivism also focuses on change, social learning, socialization, norms, etc. And we have a bit of a discussion of alternative perspectives and beyond paradigms. That's, I think, where people like Mueller, Fukuyama, Nita Crawford, Steven Pinker, especially one of the important book, Better Angels of Our Times, all come into play. So then a set of chapters that deal with the sources and mechanisms of peaceful change, international law, international institutions, technology, nuclear deterrence, climate change, political economy, democracy, social movements, you name it. I don't want to go into every topic, but and then we go into the role of great powers, rising powers as contributors, as well as detractors of peaceful change. This is a subject that I'm more and more interested. Great powers are given this aura. They are indeed very violent actors, often violence caused by choices they make by a small group of people for narrow national interests defined in terms of sometimes personal interests too. United States, Russia, China, some other pivotal states, Germany, Japan, India, Indonesia, South Africa are discussed. We missed some other pivotal states, partly because contributors were not able to come in time with the contributions. And one topic that comes to mind is, why do great powers sometimes propose peaceful change ideas, but then they abandon it? And I think Russia and China are great examples of that. Our understanding is very limited on the status quest that goes into this phenomenon of great power peace. And Russia's behavior is fascinating. As I watched a little bit of TV yesterday, it occurred to me that the Western discourse is all about Crimea, all about Russia's nasty behavior toward Ukraine. But then there's this discussion about the expansion of NATO into Russia's sphere of influence. And what the Russians are trying to do is to push NATO out. For the Westerners don't understand, NATO is a threat in their perspective that is not understood properly in this climate, I guess. Then we go into peaceful change in the regions. Some regions have transformed, and you have some of the scholars who contributed on the subject. Benny Miller is sitting there with the beautiful picture of San Francisco, where he should be right now, but I believe he is in another beautiful city of Haifa, so which is fine. We talk about the European experience, ASEAN, Africa, South America, why some regions are producing peaceful change, while others are not progressing in that same fashion, or some regions are stagnated. So we have about 41 chapters, seven substantive parts, 3 chapters historical origins, 10 chapters theoretical traditions, 8 chapters key material and ideational sources of peaceful change, 8 chapters on pivotal states that made contributions, and then 10 chapters on key regions in terms of peaceful and non-peaceful change. Let me conclude by saying that after working on this, many thoughts came to us as editors and contributors, and we have a concluding section on need for a new research agenda, which may be relevant for your discourse. First point is the IR paradigms may not be paying sufficient and coherent attention to this phenomenon. Now, when you say peaceful change, not all peaceful change is good. Okay, so there's an inherent bias is good. Some peaceful change can produce, in fact, many populist leaders come to power through peaceful elections. Second, eclectic approaches may be useful. Our PGN holding may not be working because we are trying to address things in very narrow fashion. So what are the future inquiry, what kind of things we could do, the structural conditions that generate peaceful change, the likely candidates, the relationship between peace and systemic change, domestic, political, international level change, emerging technologies and change. I think that's something fascinating in terms of what's happening in cyberspace, AI, etc. The role of social movements. We know that the Me Too movement, the climate change movement, Black Lives Matter, all have changed within a short period of time. Some of the understanding and policies, but much needs to be done in how to sustain the achievements these movements have done. State capacity challenges in terms of peace and peaceful change. methods, sources, and mechanisms and markers. And interdisciplinary approaches, I think, is very important. IR is not that engaging this interdisciplinary discourse. There is considerable literature on social change in sociology, for instance. So we need to look at them, and we need to look at some of the past work, especially in other disciplines like international law. Political science sometimes tends to not to pay attention to those literature. And finally, one of the biggest questions that puzzles is, why do peaceful changes are followed by violent cycles? Why do countries abandon peace and end up in different situations, as we are witnessing with respect to China and Russia today? And so there's a lot of research needs to be done. And this also calls for big picture IR and small picture IR combining, because this has relevance to regions at the global and regional level discourses. And of course, within countries, there's a lot of connectivities can be made. And I think hopefully some of you will have a look at the OUP handbook. It's online too. It's expensive, but it's libraries, I hope, are buying it, and engage these topics further and develop our understanding even better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, TV. It was 10 minutes, and you answered you addressed the title of the roundtable without any doubt. We have a broad agenda. So let's tour around the world without leaving the virtual Zoom room, and we'll start with Professor Markus Kornprobst from Vienna, but he's going to take us into Africa. Markus, you're 8 minutes.
Arie, many thanks. Yeah, so I also had the privilege to contribute to the Oxford Handbook on peaceful change, and wrote the Africa chapter. And when I did so, then I did some hard thinking about how I should actually do that, because if one takes what TV referred to as a minimalist approach of peaceful change, then Africa, believe it or not, actually looks quite peaceful. Yeah. So usually there's something about, so in the 1920s, the concept of peaceful change was very much associated with settling interstate disputes peacefully. And Africa, fortunately, has experienced very few direct wars between warring states. Ethiopia, Eritrea was one of them in the past, Ethiopia, Somalia. But all in all, especially considering that it's a fairly new state system, comparatively speaking, actually very little of that. The other one in terms of power transition, if one would look at, say, South Africa, end of apartheid in South Africa, South Africa emerging as a strong power within Africa. There were a few diplomatic quibbles here or there, but all in all, a very peaceful process. So in that way too, things would look very peacefully. But there obviously are real problems in Africa, in some countries more, of course, than others, in some regions more than in others. And so what I've done is basically forego IR theory and forego IR concepts, and looking at African philosophy, at practices, oftentimes on a local level, and also at the OAU and now the AU, and in terms of instruments and institutions that they have created. And what that does tell us about convergences amongst Africans on what peaceful change is supposed to mean for Africa. And doing that, I discovered 5 elements and 5 levels of peaceful change. And let me elaborate on them a little bit. So the first element is liberty. So Ali Masroui, as he put it, the Pax Africana. So Africa has to find peace for itself. In Thabo Mbeki's notion about an African renaissance, there was also, quote, something about a genuine liberation. So what that basically means is horizontal relations with the rest of the world, or with another quote, no post-colony. So that is one important element of peace and peaceful change. The other one is unity. So in order to make that possible, in order to make liberty possible, Africans have to stand together. Otherwise, outside powers are going to resort again to a policy of divide and rule, which they've obviously done for quite a while. And Pan-Africanism is to be seen, amongst other things, in that context. The third element is development. So a Basotho proverb puts it quite nicely: peace is prosperity. And in our days, we have all kinds of instruments, obviously, for development, mainly through the African Union. There's a new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPA. There's the African Peer Review Mechanism. There's the Agenda 2063. There's obviously in regional organizations also going on in terms of efforts on development. And even the names of these regional organizations, they give that already away. Yeah? So Southern African Development Community, and an EGAT in the Horn of Africa, again, so the development, the D is very much there. But in our days, oftentimes the big paradigm there is sustainable development, and then obviously comes to a considerable extent via UN processes and the Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals. The fourth big element is Pacific settlement of disputes. So in that way, it's now more traditional in terms of our thinking of peaceful change. And there is a lot to say there. So there's, on the one hand, there are traditional mechanisms. The Gakacha codes, for instance, in Rwanda, they often talked about the concept of Ubuntu. First in Zimbabwe, then in South Africa, is oftentimes also talked about. A lot also in the Horn of Africa, practiced very much in Somaliland, unrecognized, but comparatively speaking, actually quite a peaceful place. And obviously added to that, a lot of instruments that again remind us of more of UN language. In the Constitutive Act of the African Union enshrined is the responsibility to protect. So that obviously goes quite a bit beyond the UN system. In the Charter, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, you also have a notion of right to peace, which there were also attempts, obviously, in the General Assembly, but there was no unanimity reached on that effort. So again, Africa actually more far-reaching in terms of what it tries to do on a diplomatic level. And the fifth element there is democracy. And there too you have traditional manifestations. So for instance, palaver democracy, so from the Portuguese palaver, the words, talking. National conferences in Francophone Africa more recently can also be seen in that context. And again, the AU Constitutive Act is very strong on democratic consolidation. Also, these are these five elements of peaceful change as they are postulated. Then I think there are also 5 levels, and I think that's also an important one, because obviously the African state is a little different from, say, a European state or a state in North America. One level concerns the relations between non-African states and African states. And that ties in quite closely with what I said about liberty. So Africa is very much an open system. And there are horizontal or vertical relations with others. And with others does not only mean great powers, also by now it obviously means very much China, which has of course become a great power, but also means others. So states in the Gulf, for instance, and the Horn of Africa. Then the second important level is African states vis-a-vis one another. That includes then setting up international organizations such as the AU or regional organizations. There is the African state and transnational actors, and there are plenty of them. Yeah, so that ranges from non-profit actors on the one hand via multinational corporations to transnational crime, terrorist networks. So there's a lot of that. There is state and society. there are oftentimes many communities within an African state, linguistic, regional, ethnic, clan-based, what have you, and relations between the state and some of these groups are oftentimes very troublesome. And then finally, there's the issue of society and society. It's also an important one. So if one looks at say, the Horn of Africa, usually a lot of fighting among pastoral communities. So for instance, nomads versus settled farmers. The Darfur conflict, for instance, had a lot to do with that. And then obviously is the question, where do we stand if we factor in all of that? Where do we stand in terms of peaceful change? And then probably the liberation part is quite elusive in many ways, yeah, in terms of great power relations traditionally conceived, but also when it comes to the influence of transnational organizations. Unity, African solidarity is usually quite strong in international fora, say the Africa Group at United Nations. But when it comes to intra-African relations on the continent, it's oftentimes a different story. Development indicators. If we look at human development reports, then Northern and Southern Africa actually does fairly well, but Central African states in particular do not. So they're near the bottom of the ranking of states. Child mortality in some states, especially in Central Africa, is still very high. Pacific settlement of disputes, not that unsuccessful when it comes to interstate disputes, much more problematic with wars by proxy, and also with pastoral conflicts and other conflicts that oftentimes are not that much on the mind of our scholars. Democracy, again, there are more than 25 African states that are found towards the bottom of democracy rankings by The Economist. And while there are some positive examples, there obviously are really problematic ones as well. Sudan at the moment is again in the headlines. Eritrea has been highly problematic for a long time. Libya obviously is a very peculiar case, and so on. So to conclude, because I'm running out of time, I think when we look at regions in general, I think it's quite important to take into consideration the peculiarities of those regions, and try to look at them, yeah, very much along the lines how TV has suggested it, in an eclectic fashion, and also to factor in their traditions. I think if one wanted to come up now with a normative view on peaceful change in Africa, then it really would have to be a holistic one. Yes, it really would have to be one that takes into consideration these 5 elements and these 5 levels. And I think that the IR theory at the moment is not necessarily very useful to cover all of those levels and all of those elements.
Thank you, Markus, very much. It was 30 minutes about Africa, and we learned a lot. So now, quickly to Galia. Galia, you want to share a screen? As far as that's fine with me, as far as you keep the time.
Yeah, that's the only way I can keep the time. So
I remind you. Yes, you can share.
Yeah, I'm good. Okay, hi everyone. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm not good with time, so I need something to discipline me. So Arie gave me 8 minutes to talk about peaceful change at the regional context. That is, I can't do China and the US. Arie asked me also to say something inspired, at least by the chapter we wrote together on the Middle East in the now well-known Oxford Handbook on Peaceful Change. So what I want to do is offer 5 comments or insights. One of them is a more general critical comment about the concept of peaceful change, which was, I think, sort of bugging me as we were reading different parts of the story of the complex Middle East. And another 4, I guess, less critical insights from the so-called case of the Middle East that resonate with a few of the key theoretical arguments about peaceful change. Okay, where am I? Sorry. Okay, so the first point I want to make is to try to just problematize the concept of peaceful change. And for me, one of the challenges is that we don't really think about what we're contrasting peaceful change with. What are we comparing this to? And what I mean by this is two things. We can think about peaceful change, stressing the peaceful. And this is basically what most of the handbook is doing. And I think most of the discussion of peaceful change is focusing on. So what we're focusing on is the nature of change, as TV described it before, whether we can promote change through peaceful means or violent means. And I think most of our discussion is here. However, I think we also need to think about peaceful change with the emphasis of change, and to wonder, if we're talking about peaceful change, what are the alternatives? You can talk about change versus no change, or maintaining the status quo. Now, as I said, I think most of the work on peaceful change focuses on, this is built into the definition of the project on the use of peaceful means. But I think we need to think also about the change part, and I think TV actually alluded to this when he said something about how not all peaceful change is definitely and necessarily good. Why does this matter? I think this matters when you look at a region like the Middle East, where there are so many multiple regional rivalries, challenging subnational, transnational groups, ideas, and when you look at what's happening in the Middle East, then I guess peace is very often associated with stability and maintaining the status quo, and actually not with change. And there is an ongoing tension in different cases and levels that we looked at between peace, preserving peace, and peaceful change, which is something I think we need to sort of consider. So we need to keep in mind that peaceful change is not necessarily always a normatively positive concept. Sometimes it's used, actually to prevent change, because if change cannot be promoted peacefully, then no change is better. That's in the eyes of the beholder. So we need to remember in all this discussion that peace is a very political concept, and it's also often contested. And I think we need to remember that in order not to fall into this pitfall of, talking about peaceful change within a certain very specific, Western liberal community. And again, when TV talked about looking at the Russian perspective, and not only the NATO perspective, we can see that in the Middle East when we look at different groups. So that was an important point I just wanted to make. If we had time, we can talk afterwards about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's an interesting example of, how we can use peaceful change as a political concept in very different and contested ways. I will leave this at that. Okay, so now I said 4 more sort of conservative insights inspired by the study we did here, and of course doesn't cover the Middle East. Okay, one is the big ongoing question about the role of extra-regional great powers in promoting peaceful change. What we found, I think, in this chapter, and Arie, you can always correct me if you think I'm wrong, that on the one hand, we did see the crucial role of the US in bringing about the 2 most probably dramatic peaceful changes in the region, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Israel. And I guess we could talk now about the Abraham Accords and Trump. But beyond that, I think very often what we saw was that extra-regional powers played a more dominant role in actually maintaining the status quo and, either managing or preventing violent change rather than actively promoting peaceful change. Another thing, and Deli Miller's alluded to that in his work, that, extra-regional powers actually have a limited capacity to promote peaceful change if there is no regional interest involved. The other thing I wanted to point to in this regard is that I think there's very often a gap between bringing about peaceful change in a very specific case, like the US being there in the right time to give the incentives for Egypt to sign a peace treaty with Israel, and in helping to create some sort of an autonomous regional or domestic mechanism to actually enable and sustain peaceful change in the long run. This, I think, is exemplified most well in the case of the use of the role of economic incentives and peaceful change. Of course, an issue I'm very interested in myself. We do see in our cases, again, the importance of going into the domestic level, excuse me, to see domestic winners and losers from peace and the role of liberalizing coalitions. But in terms of the point I've just made before, I think the most interesting thing for me here was how the importance of building these mechanisms for promoting a preference for long-term peaceful management of changes in the region itself and not from the outside. We see this in our cases of, for example, the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt and the development of the qualified industrial zones that promote regional cooperation itself, the American idea of building a Middle Eastern free trade area, something that can sustain peaceful management of relations beyond great power intervention. Fourth point I wanted to make, and I have 1 minute or two, has to do with the relevance of domestic peaceful change to international peaceful change. And specifically, of all things we looked at, I think I want to say a few words about the limits and the pitfalls of the democratic peace idea, which sort of floated around all the time here. First of all, so we know that democracy, is all about managing changes peacefully, domestically, but we know that getting there does not always work peacefully. Hence, again, the tension between peaceful change and the goals we want to get to. The so-called Arab Spring experience that we don't have time to talk about now offers all sorts of mixed evidence. Second point I wanted to make about the democratic peace is that democratization does not necessarily lead to more support for international peaceful change. And if you look at polls in the Middle East, there's no, you do not see any correlation between support for democracy and support for, peaceful relations with Israel. So that's another point just to keep in mind. Not all good things come together. Third point is that when we look at the two big successes of peaceful change, the transition to peace with Israel, Egypt, and Jordan, these happen under non-democratic, stable regimes, and the counterfactual of what would have happened under a democratic Egypt at the time is something that we need to keep in mind, and that raises all sorts of dilemmas. And finally, when we try to adopt the democratic peace thesis as a policy guide, we've seen in the Middle East that all sorts of unintended consequences occur that may actually undermine the ability to promote peaceful change and generate also all sorts of moral dilemmas. Think about the support for, free elections in Gaza, or the whole debate about, the free elections in Egypt and the rise of the Muslim Brothers. Finally, and I won't say much about this, another issue that was very interesting in our case was the role of regional weak institutions in managing peaceful change. We looked at the Arab League and we looked at the Gulf Cooperation Council, and it was clear that these usually had very sort of conservative tendencies in terms of managing stability rather than promoting peaceful change with emphasis on change. This being said, another important point to consider, I think, is that even weak institutions still serve as focal points for symbolic sounding of collective voices, and this can raise or reduce the cost of peaceful change in ways that are beyond like the classic neoliberal institutional sort of approach to institutions, and the change within the Arab League is something we could also talk about. So it was 10 minutes instead of 8, but that's not bad for me, as Arie knows. These are my 10 minutes of thoughts. Thank you. Yeah.
Great, Galia. That was a paradigmatic. I mean,
Yeah.
so many things in 10 minutes. That was great. So, Reşat, you come next. 8 minutes that they are, in fact, in practice 10, right? But no more than that, please.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. All right, great. So after following Galia, I'm a little concerned that I did not go with a PowerPoint presentation, which certainly seems like a very good idea for organizing talks. And having this sort of scattered notes in front of me, we'll see how much I can make sense of what I was thinking about before. Once again, thank you to the organizers of particularly to the Hebrew University and Arie and Galia in particular, but everybody else as well. So I've been asked particularly to refer to minor powers in the next couple of minutes. I'll do that, but I'll also try to give some other comments. So we're in this sort of era where we hear lots of references to, of course, peace in an era of the pandemic, post-liberal order peace discussions. And all of these are interesting in their own ways, and all of them, of course, are food for thought. One item that I think bears, of course, interest for us is, continuing maybe with this idea of this peaceful and this change dimension that we just heard about again. That particularly in the past, when we were thinking about major powers, there was much greater emphasis on peace for them, referring to maybe discussions of stability. And we used to think maybe a little bit more about peace for the non-major powers in terms of something beyond perhaps stability. So if stability was all that we could hope for some of these greater powers, etc., for the rest, perhaps there was more opportunities, possibilities, as well as limitations at times. And one of the things that raises for us is, if we continue with some of the recent scholarship coming out on what does it mean to be a non-major power in an era of global change, in an area, if you want, of global transformation, we can, of course, imagine the sort of opportunities as well as limitations that there emerges. And there might be much more thought that comes into our considerations for the limitations that these entities that are not the great powers out there are facing. But we also we can think about ways in which there are more possibilities of bargaining, of maybe space to maneuver in such an era compared to eras of where there is much more, if you want, stable major power relations. So this sort of how we make of this, what we make of this, perhaps it requires more thought for us on what this current order that we are in, and of course not everybody is agreed upon whether we are really in a post something order, or whether what this post, if there is a post order, what it does look like. But if we were to turn specifically to minor powers, I think that in many ways, the explanations that we use for explaining the peace between major powers and so on also applies here. But there are some areas that I think require more thought. One of them perhaps has also come out with the two previous presentations in particular, discussions in particular. One is this item of internal peace. So we can think about this either as discussions of democratic peace and so on, but also about stateness and different ways in which we can think about stateness, whether it's in Africa or in the southern part, some other part of the world. And in that regard, then, can we have a high level of peace between countries or at a region of peace, etc., when we do not have internal peace, basically? So the sort of discussions of peace then perhaps bring us to varieties of other considerations. We can think about how, like in the previous talk, that we might have to think about a Middle Eastern peace, but in other parts of the world, we are much more willing to think about a Franco-German peace. So there's a more dyadic approach. But then still in other locations, for example, between Russia and Turkey in the past, when their relations did improve, could that have come about until both of them in this sort of earlier part of the 20th century were able to put down their domestic uprising? So can you actually have a high quality neighbor, peaceful with your neighbors, if you want, or some adversary, while you are still ongoing domestic big changes? And again, the issue isn't here about democracy or not, but perhaps even more survival security discussions. So these ideas that we used to see particularly emphasized about third world security discussions, perhaps being emphasized to us in varieties of ways about the domestic internal security considerations of the elites and of the regime, and how this comes to also influence how they see whether it's another country or countries in a region in their approach to it, and how there might be ways of creating these sorts of fifth columnists, etc. So that's one item, is sort of how we think about security and particularly internal peace discussions and the sort of stateless dimensions, all of them coming together. The other item is, of course, and again, following from the last one, from Galia's point, about extra regional and extra powers. So in this consideration, these other entities, these, let's call them again minor powers, in a world of major powers where, again, in today's world, specific position for the UN Security Council, permanent members, etc., there's a certain special rules, responsibilities, obligations that these entities have, which then come to influence also what is possible as well as not possible for the minor powers, perhaps. And again, what that also not only can be thought about as a limitation, but also if you think about something like UN peacekeeping operations, which past research shows has played some positive roles in discussions of peace. In that regard, then, that again says that a lot of our considerations for reinsurance, which again, some of the people on this panel have also, in this roundtable have also mentioned, can be emphasized through the role of these sort of major powers, great powers, whatever you want to label them as, and how they can actually play both hindering roles, but also varieties of roles that we have to bring in to our considerations. So again, those are some of the things that I can immediately at the top of my mind bring into minor powers, both these issues of internally how we understand them, as well as the special role that they face in conjunction to the international system, major powers, and how major powers can guarantee or in some ways actually be part of the problem. The other two things that I want to mention is that we need to perhaps, going away from minor powers, remember that how we envisage peace over time, it changes dramatically. So some research that I did a long time ago, and some of the work that Diehl, Gertz, and Balazs pointed out in some of their data collections, if these high levels of peace really come about in the post-World War II era, then actually tells to us maybe something about how the peace has been understood differently at different times, and perhaps ideas that are of identity, culture, religion, etc., need to be brought in even more to these discussions at time as well. So that if, for example, you do not recognize the others who, due to different religion or due to different race, as being an equivalent to you, can this person then can we really formulate a high level of peace? And again, there are discussions of cultural similarities, dissimilarities here. But some of these dimensions might be even more important for understanding how societies over time have expanded their understanding of peace, and at times also changed what is necessary for peace as well. So peace treaties, for example, are not seen as being a crucial dimension to peace discussions as they were in the pre-1954 and so on era. So what we understand of peace, what we bring into peace, what we take out from peace, and how we approach it requires also changes over time, and also space. And yeah, the final point, I guess, is that there are varieties of ways in which we might need to consider human security discussions. So something that actually Pınar Bilgin also pointed out a long time ago, you know, this sort of considerations of macro, meso, and different levels essentially in much more together. So whether that is bringing in these discussions of human security next to stable peace discussions, there might be ways that can help us in broadening our understanding of what peaceful change can mean to different individuals, groups, and the environment, etc., in the particular areas of interest of ours. Let me conclude here.
Reşat?
Yeah, fine. I somehow managed to close my camera, but I'll stop here. Okay.
Okay. And you did an academic miracle. You talk for 8 minutes sharp. Okay. That does not mean, Benny, that you get more than 8 minutes. So Benny, your turn, please.
Thank you very much, Arie and Galia, for the initiative and for the invitation. Okay, in the post-Cold War era, the United States attempted to pursue peaceful change of the whole world, more or less. It tried to do it by liberalizing the world, but this failed. And my focus here will be to try to explain why this failure to pacify the world by liberalizing it. This liberalization strategy and pacification based on that was based on 3 legs. One is obviously unipolarity and the huge freedom of action of the United States, supposedly under unipolar structure. The second element is the liberalizing, the pacifying mechanism of liberalism, obviously democratic peace, institution, economic independence. And thirdly, the strong belief in the universality of liberalism, namely it applies everywhere, to every culture, every region, and so on, not only to the West. Why this major attempt failed? I will provide three explanations, but the first one will be based on realism, but then I will have 2 explanations related to nationalism, especially to ethnic nationalism and its influence. Realism actually explain not so much why the pacification of the world made actually, and the liberalization of the world by the United States made the world less liberal and less peaceful than when the United States started this liberalization and pacification. Realism basically argued about, power transition, the growing power of the rising powers, notably China, to some extent Russia, obviously limit American freedom of action. The rising power have their demands and their aspiration, for example, for sphere of influence near the borders, and that leads to conflict and clashes with the West, particularly with the United States. But then we'll move to nationalism, because nationalism here contributes 2 elements. 2 general elements that I will try to specify. One key element is the substance of the conflict in today's world. There are actually 3 major types of conflict. One is the attempt of the rising powers, notably China and Russia, to establish a sphere of influence. Secondly, civil wars in failed state. And thirdly, the depolarization in the West, in Western democracy, due to the rise of nationalist populism. And my argument that every one of these 3 major conflicts in today's world, the substance of them can be explained by ethnic nationalism. Okay, starting with China and Russia, obviously there is the realist element of sphere of influence that every great power aspires to establish near its border. But if we look at the specific substance of China, obviously vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also the maritime dispute that you can't elaborate, and Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine and other post-Soviet territories, we see the idea of national unification, which is a key ingredient of nationalism. Namely, nationalism argues that the whole nation should be included under a single political entity. And that's what Russia, at least according to their belief, Russia and China try to establish in their respective region. And that's where the limits also for their expansion, at least for the time being. Then moving to civil wars in failed states. Here we see the opposite of national unification, namely the absence of a common national identity in all these places, and actually rival sectarian or ethnic ideas about what the nation should be and what the state that should reflect this nation should be. On the other hand, we have trans-border national identities or ethnic or sectarian identities. And that explains the foreign intervention in the failed state, notably Iran, for example, using the Shiite card in order to be heavily involved in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, but also other powers, other regional powers, use these trans-border, the shared trans-border identities in order to intervene in failed states. And that explains kind of the greater Middle East, South Asia, and parts of Africa conflict. And thirdly, moving to the West and the polarization due to the rise of, especially in the second decade of the 21st century, the rise of nationalist populism, there are obviously a number of explanations of that. But my argument, the key issue here, again, is national identity. The key issue, the key debate is actually, what is the national identity? What is to be an American? What is to be French? Does it mean, basically the clash is between the ideas of civic nationalism, namely the nation is composed of all its citizens, like in France and the United States, supposedly, or ethnic nationalism. The United States is basically make America great again. It means back to the 50s when the United States was controlled by white Christians. And similarly in Europe, a similar kind of populist nationalism, raising the kind of race and religion issue and identity as the key issue of forming the national identity, against the ideas of civic nationalism that will include every citizen, irrespective of its race, religion, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. Finally, the other key effect of nationalism is to explain the boomerang effects of the American-led attempts to pacify the world by liberalizing it. Namely, what I'm trying to argue is that there still are major unintended outcomes of this huge American effort to liberalize the world and through that to pacify it in the post-Cold War era. And looking at the revisionist powers, at China and Russia, here is their at least perceived America establishing a liberal alliances near its borders as an attempt to encircle them, and also American attempt to try to change the regime in different ways, not through military intervention, but by other means, as an attempt to shape their domestic character. And nationalism always rejects this idea that foreign forces will shape the domestic character of the state of their nation, and that leads to this rejection of Western liberalism and American attempt to pursue peaceful change by this liberalism. But then about the failed states, here the problem, at least in some of the leading cases of the failed states, starting with Iraq 2003, Libya 2011, Afghanistan 2001, partly Syria also during the Arab Spring, is actually the America made them failed states by intervening and by trying to do regime change and democracy promotion. Obviously, the most dramatic case is Iraq 2003, but the other cases similar. So the United States actually created civil wars and foreign intervention in all these places because it wanted actually to promote democracy and through that to pacify the Middle East, and the outcome is precisely the opposite. Then about the third type of major conflict in today's world, the polarization, populism in the West. And here, obviously, we see a long list of the effect of the unintended outcomes of American attempts to liberalize the world. Starting with globalization, one key ingredient of this liberalization, pacification effort by the United States, that actually succeeded. Obviously with China in 2001, China joining the WTO and so on. But what was the effect on the West? Growing unemployment, a freeze of salaries, of income, and that a major element in the rise of populism. Secondly, and now we move to the cultural element of populism, identity and so on, that's migration. Liberalism encourages migration, and the effect was this rise of populism against using the migration issue in order to challenge liberalism and domestic peace in the West. Obviously, most notably, January 6th, we just celebrated, quote unquote, the 1-year anniversary of this major attack. We talked about failed states and civil wars in the Middle East and so on, but actually there's now some people in the United States argue that the United States is maybe not too far from some elements of a civil war, and obviously January 6th and the attack on Capitol Hill is a major manifestation of this huge threat of large-scale violence in the heart of the democratic world. Then in international institutions, the United States try to promote international institutions in order to promote peaceful change. What is the outcome? The outcome is this rejection by nationalist populists because they argue it jeopardizes national sovereignty. And that also able to mobilize quite a bit of support in the West. The internet was a major idea that actually there will be freedom of information all over the world, and that actually will democratize authoritarian states, and democracies will flourish because they are open societies and everything will be great, and an authoritarian state will lose their control over information. What happened was precisely the opposite. The strong authoritarian powers use the internet in order to create divisions in the West, while the West, as open society, is unable to control the internet. Without all the efforts to regulate internet and so on, it doesn't look, it leads to that. And the outcome is all the huge polarization in Western society. Finally, the military intervention of the United States, overly particularly in order to promote democracy, supposedly to bring peace, that created huge disenchantment in American society against this, what President Trump called the forever wars, and led to rejection and to resentment of American global leadership and America providing global collective goods to the whole international system. And even President Biden, even though supposedly coming from completely different approach than Trump, we saw the withdrawal from Afghanistan based on the idea that the United States should leave all these wars because of the huge disappointment, disenchantment that it generated in American society, and then the limits that it puts on American ability to continue to engage in the world. So the bottom line is realism plays here an important role, but the key role explaining these new types of conflict emerging in recent years is various elements related to identity, and particularly ethnic national identity, as affecting this emerging conflict and explaining the failure of the United States to pursue peaceful change through liberalizing the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benny. Although that was 30 minutes and not 8 minutes, you're not disciplined as Reşat. So Charlie, you are the last. I hope you managed to take the kids to school this morning in the US for you. It's nice to see my former teacher and friend here. So Charlie, I suggest to you, but you can talk about what you want, whether you want to tell people here about this intriguing idea about the global concert or something else. Please, Charlie, try to keep that to 8 minutes. Let's see if you are disciplined.
I will keep it under 8 minutes because I know we want to have a lot of time for conversation. Good to see everybody, happy to be a part of this dialogue. I'm going to just make 3 quick points, Arie. My first builds very much on what Benny just had to say, because I think he's putting his finger on very important developments that are taking place in the United States, in the democratic world, and more globally. And so my first point in some ways goes back to my own thinking about peaceful change, coming out of a book I wrote about a decade ago called How Enemies Become Friends. And in that book, I articulated a framework for peace building that relies heavily on strategic restraint, accommodation, trading concessions as the beginning of peaceful change, then building into deeper societal integration and narrative change. And I pose a question to the group, and here's where my comments will intersect very much with Benny's. Is the age of illiberal populism, and yes, I agree it has very strong elements of ethnic identity, is this an age that's not going to be kind to peacemaking? In part because domestic politics, at least in my own research, were one of the main blockage to pursuing peace, because populism, ethnic nationalism, the inability of presidents to find that they have a domestic consensus behind them makes it very difficult to pursue strategies of accommodation and strategies of restraint. Here in the United States, our foreign policy consensus has collapsed. Foreign policy has been politicized. Foreign policy has been downgraded in its importance, in part because of the America First focus of the United States, a legitimate focus stemming from the fact that we have big problems here at home. So whether it was Trump trying to pursue accommodation with Russia, but blocked by Congress, Trump pulling back on Cuba, Trump competing with Biden over who could be tougher on China, Biden now looking in trouble if he makes an accommodation with Russia on Ukraine, Brexit and the standoff over Northern Ireland with the EU, the Balkans and Dodik, Turkey, the list goes on and on. Right now, domestic politics are not conducive to the kinds of strategies that, at least in my mind, promote peaceful change. And I think it's particularly difficult in the era of social media, of cyberspace. It's difficult for governments to control their messaging on these issues, which makes it more difficult for them to build domestic consensus. The second observation I'll make here will be to pick up on your invitation, Arie, to say a word or two about concerts. In addition to these domestic factors, the illiberal populism, and in my mind, I'd be interested to hear what Benny has to say on this. This is fundamentally economic in nature. I agree with Benny that there has been liberal overreach, and that liberal overreach has in many respects led to stagnant wages in the United States and in other Western countries, and that is the politics of grievance plays well. The politics of grievance pushes us in a populist direction. But another factor that's at play here is multipolarity. And in my mind, we are moving into a world which for the first time in history will be irreversibly, inescapably globalized and interdependent, but no longer managed by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. Because to be politically incorrect, ever since globalization set in the post-Napoleonic Wars era, it was either the UK or the US that minded the store, that created a rules-based system, that provided public goods. Those days are over. The world's largest economy will soon be in the hands of China. 2/3 of the world already trades more with China than with the United States. And so in this setting, I do think we need to ask, do we have an architecture? Do we have vehicles that are well suited to promote peaceful change, or at least manage global relations in an era of globalized multipolarity? And I think the answer to that is no. It's not surprising to me that we're moving to small group formats, whether G7, G20, six-party talks, the Iran contact group, different groupings, because in many respects, the big global institutions aren't up to the task. I, in my own research, can think of only one era in which you had normed, governed, stable multipolarity, and that was the 19th century concert of Europe. And it was on the basis of that history that my colleague at CFR, Richard Haas, and I recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs calling for a global concert as a way of trying to create continuous strategic dialogue about the world's major players. But I also think that concert-like systems can be very useful in other settings, whether it's in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. Getting the right people to the table is key. And I think concerts have two features that make them particularly good at promoting peaceful management. One is that they tend to block domestic structure as a key factor. They enable countries to focus on international cooperation, even if they differ on matters of domestic governance. And secondly, they are procedurally informal. They focus on building consensus rather than on statements and a more formalized, rule-based, codified multilateralism. My final point, and I guess this, I'm just going to kind of pose this as a question, and it really grows out of Benny's final comment. Does it matter? And if it does matter, is it good or bad that the United States, the country I live in, and I'm here in Washington, D.C., is one big political hot mess? And I have to say, I'm not particularly optimistic that it's going to get a lot better. I'm guessing the Republicans are going to take the House this November. Who knows what's going to happen in 2024? But this is a critical moment for the future of American democracy. And I'm of two different minds. On the one hand, I share Benny's comment that the United States has bitten off more than it can chew, that it created a mess in the Middle East, and that it too zealously promoted liberalism. On the other hand, I am someone who thinks that on balance, the United States has tilted the arc of history toward more democracy, more justice, more decency. And if the United States isn't playing that role and isn't out there as a functioning, respected liberal democracy, it's going to set back the world. And so given that this is an international group, people hailing from many different countries, I simply pose the question, which is it? How much of a factor could it be for the rest of you if the United States enters a period in which its core liberal democratic institutions are compromised and not functioning as intended by the founders? I will stop there, Arie.
And you kept your promise, 8 minutes. Okay, so let me, now Galia, you can count. Let me take no more than 2 minutes, maybe 3, so we'll still have 15 minutes just to, I'm not a discussant and I was not supposed to offer my own talks, but very, very quickly, since this is incredibly rich and we could stay for hours, but I know there is Zoom fatigue. Regarding TV, this intriguing point that peaceful change might lead to violence and then from violence back to peace, right? Which reminds me of all the time we're talking about peaceful change like an elephant, right? The blind people and the elephant, that you can trace different things, which is the overlap between peace and peaceful change. And maybe another comment is why not many have written about peaceful change, right? I mean, I think most of the people who have written about peaceful change are in this Zoom session, right? And we are a minority. Okay, Markus, just a reflection, and you can hear from my accent, many of the things that you mentioned, I could think about Latin America instead of Africa. I mean, the same 5 elements and the same 5 levels. So whether there is something similar or something unique, or I don't remember TV in the volume that you edited, there is a chapter about Latin America, right? I mean, I could lecture about that, but we don't have time. Galia, this idea, right, that we talk about that when we wrote that chapter, that peaceful change versus a status quo, and whether peace is status quo and peaceful change is not what is promoted, right? I think about the Israel-Palestinian case. At the beginning, there was an attempt of peaceful territorial change. It failed, and maybe we prefer status quo to peace. Reşat, you brought this interesting idea that instead of focusing about great powers or minor powers, this interaction. And if you want to hear more about that, Reşat will be talking in 2.5 hours from now. Too many, challenging points in the international affairs special issue that TV and Markus edited, and I wrote every single article. I learned a lot. I love that article by Stephen Chan, I think, from Boulder. I think he's from China. He wrote in the US. I don't think he could write that article in China about China, but he had a very intriguing argument that it's not the China. We call China all the time revisionist. Maybe the US has been much more revisionist than China. which echoes the last point by Charlie. And the second point to Benny, I'm not sure whether we should blame globalization for this boomerang effect, for poverty and inequality. I have an entire book about that, and I think it's much more complicated. It's a bit simplistic to blame globalization for the troubles that they are in Charlie's country. And finally, to Charlie, again, that great book that you wrote, Charlie, was not only about peaceful change, it was about stable peace, right? And stable peace and peaceful change, they might overlap, but they are not always the same. And I think that you leave us with the interesting question, right? Whether the role of the US is indispensable, right? If we ask our common colleague, Robert Lieber, right, Bob would say, of course. But if you ask Barry Wuzan, right, with his British approach, he would say, so what, right? The international order will survive after the US. So that's, I think, the interesting question. We are so obsessed with the role of the US that we think that if the US is getting into not the best time of his history, right, the international society will completely decay. I think that was 2 minutes. Okay, so what I would suggest, instead of turning to the panelists, I should give the floor back only to Reşat and Charlie, who were the only discipline, and then to Galia in that order. Let's open for comments and questions from the floor. You can use the chat, or you can use the old-fashioned nice way of, raising your yellow electronic hand, or just jumping in the Israeli style. Okay, and yes.
Yes, this is Manas Chatterjee from Washington, D.C. It was a great presentation of all the presenters. But one thing I should mention, but nobody said anything about the military expenditure for the developed countries. And also nobody considered the question of ethics of peace. These are the two most important things. The question of military expenditure, even like a country like India, for example, it talks about Mahatma Gandhi and so on and so forth, but it exports most of the arms to other countries. So military expenditure, this is a crucial thing in the development of poor countries. The question of these are the things more important than peace, rather than the structural thing we were discussing before.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Achim, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Very short, yes.
Yeah, a very brief question and curiosity, by the way, to Markus. I'm Achim from Tokyo, and my question is concerning your list of criteria for peace making in Africa. Now, in Ivory Coast, one of the elements that we considered at the time before the closure of the peacekeeping mission, and actually that works quite well, and this is my question to you, was the use of traditional knowledge and traditional tribunals to settle peace in the community. This worked even better sometimes than the national law. So my question is, in your research and your study, how far you've been finding across this issue of traditional ways of peace building? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, more questions. Yes. Yes, other questions, comments to the panelists about the relevance of peaceful change in those turbulent times. Yes. Come on, this is what my former teacher Gilpin said. This is the perennial problem in IR, right? This is a big issue, right? We are not talking about quantitative methods. Sorry, right? Galia, you're asking. Yes.
Yeah, it's the wrong thing. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I have a few quick questions. Benny, I was actually, when thinking of peaceful change, I was waiting for you to talk about offensive liberalism, because offensive liberalism is really the example of how liberal ideas can actually be manifested through violent change to promote conditions that will maybe in the long run promote peaceful change, going back to what TV said about the cycles of, you know, peaceful change, violence, and all that. So I'm wondering where that fits in. Do you think of what Russia is doing, you know, in terms of, you know, the fake news stuff and using, you know, social media and all that stuff? Is that an attempt of peaceful change on part of the Russians, you know, in their competition vis-a-vis the US? I'm still, you know, trying to understand the change thing there and what we call peaceful change. Charlie, I guess I have two questions. One, does this lead us back to like regionalism and regional orders in terms of how we can better manage peaceful change if we're talking about the need to work in small groups and generate concerts? And in that respect, is, you know, an area like Southeast Asia already better sort of placed because they already have something that is less formal, more focused on, you know, building consensus. They have more experience in that. So I wonder if they're better actually positioned to manage these well. And I wanted to connect what you asked about the US and what Reşat was saying about internal peace and external peace. And I'm wondering if you think that the US has a problem with an internal peace now, and what impact this has on its ability to promote external peace. And finally, just you know, illiberal populism, is that necessarily a bad thing for peacemaking? You were asking. I had just two thoughts there. One is, you know, again, going back to the Middle East and Trump and Abraham Accords. When Trump initiated his, you know, I forgot the name, his big peace plan, we were all extremely skeptical and very, very sort of critical here. And Arie can, you know, remember how we spoke about this initially. But at the end of the day, the Abraham Accords, according to many people, would not have happened without Trump. So maybe it's not necessarily sort of correlated what happens within a state and within the US and its ability to promote peaceful change if it suits its strategic interests elsewhere. So maybe we're sort of over-reading into this importance of liberal democracy and promoting peaceful change. And maybe if we have an illiberal populist US that is embedded in an interdependent world, which is a fact, okay? At the end of the day, even a populist US that wants to promote its own national interest will understand that it needs to play in an interdependent world. So maybe there's still more hope for cooperation, even with illiberal populist powers that are still interdependent.
Who knows? You ask wonderful questions, Galia. We need 3 more hours. Okay, we have 7 minutes. So what we are going to do, we'll take the reverse order. And you really have to be disciplined, but we will leave Galia to the end because I mean, you asked those wonderful questions. So let's start with Charlie. Charlie, 1 minute. Take what you want as a politician. No, as a political scientist.
You know, just picking up on Galia's last point, I wish that I believed that the era of illiberal populism is going to produce good results. And I hear what you said about Trump and the Abraham Accords. Maybe someone in their closing remarks who has studied those can offer a perspective. I see them as a kind of outlier that has more to do with Iran and the political developments in the region than some deeper piece, but I'd be interested to learn more about it. But I especially, I guess, because I do live here and see what's happening in American politics, I worry that if the lights of liberal democracies are not on, right? If we're not out there in a kind of enlightened way trying to deal with a world that is going to be as challenging as any world in a long time, I think we're going to get it wrong, especially if the political center here and in other countries collapses. and major leaders are trying to make it through the day rather than attempting to look externally and solve global problems. And Lord knows, with climate change, with cybersecurity, with nuclear proliferation, the challenges that we face externally are going up, not down. And I just do worry deeply that if we don't get our shit together domestically, we're not going to be able to deal with the international agenda.
Okay, Charlie, not very optimistic, but that's life. Benny, 1 minute or even less, because you talked 30 minutes before. Yes.
Okay, punishment, crime and punishment. Okay, yeah, I agree first of all with Charlie, but yeah, China and yeah, I think China is revisionist. I mean, at least in the sense that it's tried to change the status quo. So it's a revision, whether it's good or bad, that's anyone's judgment, but definitely try to change the status quo and the international order in different ways, and definitely to establish its hegemony at the minimum. It's in its own region, so it's revised the regional order. So in this sense, it's revisionist. Globalization led to freezing of income in the West and unemployment, and that's one major source of the rise of Trumpism and illiberal populism and so on. It's not, I don't think it's the main reason, but it's an important reason for that. So then you like it or not, you can judge it accordingly. Offensive liberalism, yes, that's what I was talking about. That was the United States, definitely the regime change and the democracy through the use of force is a major manifestation of offensive liberalism. The internet, I think that the liberal idea was the internet will be a mechanism of peaceful change, because authoritarian powers will lose their control, their monopoly over information, and that will lead to freedom and peace and all the good things that liberals believe. But what happened is precisely the opposite. It harms the democracies because they are open societies and leads to cleavages and polarization and all this, while the authoritarian power use it in order to maximize the polarization in Western society. About the Abraham Accords, okay, I will.
Reşat, sorry, the Abraham Accords, Charlie, there is a new book by Barak Rabin, by the way. Maybe it might be translating to English, I guess. Reşat, your points.
Yeah, I was worried that you were going to ask me to talk about the Abraham Accords, and I would be
the
wrong person to ask about that. I'll just, for the sake of it, just take a slightly more optimistic tone and mention that if you collect the peaceful change discussions to the sort of, let's call it quality of peace discussions, it depends a little bit on what sort of quality and, let's say, gradient of peace that you're talking about at these lowest gradients of peace, getting out of them. So moving from the lowest grade to the little higher grade than that. So let's call it from the lowest to the medium one. There we tend to see it's not public opinion, but rather much more the role of elites, leadership, etc. And that might suggest that rather than what the public wants, if some, let's call it authoritarian leader, some other presidential character, etc., in a somewhat of a democracy wants to move forward, it might be doable. But for the sort of much higher, deeper qualities of peace, then we get to, of course, back to public opinion. So again, it might be having to bring in the sort of the type of peace that we have in mind in these discussions as well. Thank you.
Okay, Galia, you asked the best questions, so you don't have time right now. Maybe we'll come back to you. Markus, to you. You got this question about the Ivory Coast. We cannot hear you, Markus.
Sorry. No, thanks a lot for all the questions. There's really 5 things very, very quickly in a minute. So the first one, Arie, yes. I mean, so there definitely are parallels between Latin America and Africa. And to some extent, ideas that are important in Africa for peace now, they actually came from Latin America, yeah? I mean, like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for instance. But I think that there nevertheless are also very pronounced differences. So if you think about jihadist movements in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, if we think about patterns of transnational crime, pirates, and so on and so forth, but definitely there's similarities and differences. A second one, weapons proliferation. That was a very, very important point. Yeah, so small arms, light weapons. I mean, there's been a massive pouring of weapons into conflict zones in Africa with absolutely devastating results. And there are the Nairobi Protocol and everything. There are legally binding instruments on the table, but they haven't changed much, unfortunately. Third point, yes, on the Ivory Coast and traditional knowledge. A lot of studies about this now that suggest that traditional healing mechanisms, very much in a local context, are of utmost importance. So especially reconciliation cannot be superimposed from top down, but really has to come bottom up. Fourth point, very quickly, because it's been mentioned by a few, so digitalization, that obviously is a communications revolution. And I think many of the things that we've talked about have something to do with that. Yeah? So transnational networks, be they populist, be they right-wing, be they jihadists, whatever. And it really is a communications revolution. And if one would put that into perspective, then one could probably even draw parallels to printing press long time ago, or Marshall McLuhan, the TV, radio, and all of that. And the last point, discussions about so treaties, whether they're going to uphold the Abraham Accord. I think the Iranian nuclear deal, Galia, is also something that you've mentioned very quickly. I'm also a little bit pessimistic there, yeah, because I think that some of those agreements, the Iranian nuclear deal in particular, are so complicated. So where the one side has to deliver something, the other one has to follow up, and so on and so forth. And if there is domestic, there's always domestic criticism and all kinds of domestic ambushes against treaties and implementing treaties. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to take care of really important issues, such as the issue of Iran and nuclear weapons.
Okay. We are over time, but you start all this mess of reviving peaceful change. I mean, I wrote back 94, you wrote in the 90s, and now, so you have the last word, my friend.
You are
and then you can get coffee.
You are the inspiration, Arie, and it's good that we are back together on this. I'll pick 2 points. One is the cyclical nature we talked about, and I think Charlie also mentioned, is this something irredeemable at this point? I think history tells us that we were in worse situations before. Everybody knows the post-Napoleonic world, 1914, 1919, 1930s, etc. And within the United States also, 1960s, such polarization, intense civil wars like situation going on. And so what is missing today, at least from my perspective, is sort of that great leader or leaders who can bring us together. And every country today is led by people who are mediocre and they don't have the kind of vision. And so that's connected to this, Trumpism and all. They may bring some episodic changes, but there's no grand vision there. And I think that leadership should be thought through for order change. The final or the second point that I want to make is the liberal triumphalism. I think the liberals have a great difficulty at giving or accommodating these non-liberal challengers, because liberals think they have the truth with them, and probably they have, I don't know. So status considerations are very important here. I think the Russia and China, less so, working in terms of spheres of influence, the old ideas of great power status. Whereas liberal great powers of powers think that notion is over, that we are in charge of the world. And so we need to broaden this discussion about status with respect to status accommodation, status depreciation, status humiliation, status resurgence, and how that is connected to this current conflict at the great power level, but a lot more than economic or other issues involved. So socio-psychological issues are also important, I think. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. I want to leave with the non-political correct thinking. Galia, you were asking maybe Russia using all these not nasty soft power. Maybe China is doing something similar, not with soft power, but with economic power, right? That's at least what they say. Who knows? Anyway, it was a pleasure hosting this session. I look at the watch, and in 10 minutes we have a session E. So we still have 6 hours to go. My God, I need a vacation. That's what Terminator Schwarzenegger said, right? In Terminator 2 after this. So I invite you to continue with this. Thank you very much, all the participants, all the panelists. Okay, we leave this open for those of you who are in channel 1, and then we'll reopen channel 2 and channel 3. Thank you very much. All the best. I stop recording, I'm leaving. You can do whatever.